Why was the Snyderverse so divisive? Oh, Mick, that's obvious. It's not as obvious as you think it is. The reason the Snyderverse was so divisive because it was sold by WB as an alternative to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the MCU. It was sold as the direct comparison to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You've got this bunch of films made by, let's say, a divisive director in Zack Snyder. You see, the interesting thing when you look at Snyder's career is people loved him for his first zombie movie and loved him for 300. The real hate and divisive nature around Snyder began when he made Watchmen, because that was a high-profile comic book movie. A lot of comic book nerds knew what Watchmen was more than what 300 was. And a lot of fans of cape shit didn't like what Snyder did with Watchmen. That's when the real problems began for Zack with some comic book fans. I'm not a comic book reader. I'm a fan of moving pictures. I'm a fan of comic book movies and television, as well as other movies and television. So my comic book knowledge isn't all that. So when I watch Watchmen, I have a geek boner and orgasm over it because I haven't read the comics. So I don't know if Zack Snyder, took liberties with the source material or not. I'm just watching this amazing, visually compelling movie. You understand? But that's where the problems began for Zack with Watchmen. You see, what's interesting with the Snyderverse is that you've got Man of Steel, that's the brainchild of David Goyer. People feel and still think wrongly that Man of Steel was the narrative brainchild of Zack Snyder. It wasn't Zack Snyder who wanted to snap Zod's neck, wanted Superman to snap Zod's neck, snap Zod's neck. That was David Goyer's brainchild. Even Nolan questioned that idea. But it all went wrong. The Snyderverse went wrong and became very divisive because what happened was WB wanted an alternative and a comparison to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Instead of selling it to the public the way they sold, the Dark Knight trilogy, basically just a set of films. Dark Knight came out in 2008, the same year that Iron Man came out. There was no comparisons, there was no issue, there was no problem, because they weren't mis-selling it as, the MCU. But Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, and all those other DCEU films were being compared to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So it's a big issue because you've got this alternative, comparison to the MCU, which is nothing like the MCU. They're kind of elseworldy type of movies. They're darker movies. They're making a statement about superheroes in the real world. The Marvel Cinematic Universe was very, very different. The Marvel Cinematic Universe was made for the family audience because they wanted to make real money on these movies. So you've got WB, who want Snyder, Nolan and Goyer to make a mainstream Superman movie. But Nolan and Goyer and Snyder are pulling in a different direction than the studio. So it doesn't work. And then you've got the audience who are watching trailers being made to think that Man of Steel is going to be this mainstream Superman movie, when it's not. They're sold this movie called Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice. All the trailers are sold to you, this movie's sold to you like it's a popcorn chomping, fight, a WWF Raw fight between Batman and Superman. When the fans go and see that movie, they get a mere 9 minutes of fighting between Batman and Superman. And the fans rightly are saying, but you told us this was a Batman versus Superman movie. Do you get me? Do you get me where it all went wrong? I love the Snyderverse. I really do. What they should have done is allow Snyder, Goya and Nolan, they shouldn't have fired Goya after Man of Steel. They should have allowed Zack's vision, Goya's and Nolan's vision to be seen throughout the 5 movies or however many movies they were going to make. And then after that, make this mainstream, kind of alternative comparison to the MCU. Bring in Bruce Timm or whoever they wanted to bring in to do it. So I understand what WB's issues were with the Snyderverse. It was very, very divisive. I remember a WB CEO reacting to the reviews of David Ayer's Suicide Squad, which wasn't David Ayer's Suicide Squad anyway, because they tampered with it. He said, I don't know how much more of this we can take. It's so divisive. And, so I understand where WB were coming from. As a business, they wanted a comparison, an alternative to the MCU. But when you bring in Christopher Nolan and David Goyer and Zack Snyder, that's not what you're going to get. So then the question is, why did you bring these men in if you wanted a comparison and an alternative to the MCU? They were never going to make that happen. I explained the other day with the whole, Finding Solo thing, that the reason they don't want to work with that director because he's an auteur. And auteurs don't take notes. They do what they want to do. And that makes it very, very difficult to try and get a mainstream audience who have been kind of bred on the MCU, the dumbed down form of entertainment. Personally, I think Steven Soderbergh's Finding Solo could be a very interesting movie. And in fact, I think it could make Disney and Lucasfilm a lot of money. It may even save Star Wars. But that's just my personal opinion. See, this is why the Snyderverse was so divisive. So it's a similar problem to what they had with Tim Burton's 2 Batman movies. This is why Burton was never allowed to make a Batman 3, because Batman Returns was really, really dark. You had Penguin biting somebody's nose off and blood squirting from their face, right? Bit hard to get parents to bring in their children to watch a movie when you're doing that. And they weren't really able to sell the merch they wanted to children because of that vision. Again, I love what Burton did with his 2 Batman movies. He's the pioneer. If it wasn't for Burton's Batman movies and vision towards Batman, none of the takes we had from Batman lately, whether it's Reeves' version, whether it's Snyder's version, whether it's Nolan's version, would ever have been a reality. Those movies happened because they were inspired by what Tim Burton actually did. Tim Burton is a fucking pioneer. But that's the problem. That's why the Snyderverse is still so divisive to this day. Because WB wanted an MCU, but they brought in the wrong people to give them an MCU. But they were seeing how much money and interest the MCU had and was making via the general audience, and they wanted the same thing. And they wanted Snyder, Goyer and Nolan to give it to them. But they're not the men, they're not the people to do that for you. Now, Nolan was able to make a lot of money with The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises. But it was still a definitive style. It was still an auteur's movie, and it wasn't being, compared to what they were doing with the MCU. The MCU is interesting, especially Phase 1, because there's a lot of, reviled and hated MCU Phase 1 movies. MCU fans hated Thor. MCU fans hated Captain America, the First Avenger, which I think is a really, really fine movie, by the way. So there was a lot of movies, and it's interesting, actually, when you look at Thor sets up Loki, who's actually the main villain in the first Avengers movie. I mean, I think when fans saw Avengers and liked Loki as a villain in that movie, they didn't know what to do with the Thor movie that they hated, because, hang on a minute, He's a great villain. He's in Avengers, right? We love Avengers, but we didn't like Thor. So that's interesting as well. And so this is what happened. This is what went wrong. You got WB, who want a cinematic universe, a comic book cinematic universe like the MCU, but they've got people that don't want to do it. So they're trying to convince and harass these auteurs to make them an MCU. And as you know, as clear as night follows day, that was never going to happen, right? But they were in the middle of something. They shouldn't have got rid of Goya. They should have done Man of Steel 2. They should have made the movies that Zach and Chris and David wanted to make, and then put that to bed, and then bring in someone to do an MCU. But here's the thing. James Gunn was never the man to do that. Never the man to make a competent mainstream universe. I'll never understand what Zaslav was thinking of. I mean, it's insane to me. I was watching a video from someone ranting about James Gunn's Superman. Not even a Snyder bro, right? Not even a Snyder fan, right? Not even a Superman fan. And he identified all the problems I had with James Gunn's Superman. James Gunn, when announcing he was directing Superman, pretty much admitted that Peter Safran pressured him into directing that movie. Even Gunn knew he was incapable of making a great, competent Superman movie. It's as simple as that. So they could have brought in someone competent. But the problem is, the issue they have, right, and the divisive nature today of the DC fandom goes back to the Snyderverse and them not allowing Zack, Christopher Nolan and David Goyer to finish what they started. All they had to do was allow that to play out and then do their cinematic universe. Let's not forget the Snyderverse was making money. The DCEU at the beginning was making money. Yes, the reactions were divisive from critics and fans, but MOS made 667, 668. Batman vs Superman made just under $1 billion. Not the money they wanted, but still solid. Suicide Squad, the first one, made just under 800 million. Terribly reviewed. By the way, Wonder Woman, 800 million. Critics and fans loved it. Jason Momoa's, James Wan's Aquaman, $1 billion. So when you look at the box office of early DCEU, it wasn't like it wasn't competitive. But the divisive nature and reaction from some fans and critics was so loud, the optics were problematic for WB. And the more they panicked about the divisive nature of the Snyderverse, the dumber the decisions they were making. And it's led to where we are now. But if you just allowed the Snyderverse to play out, right? It was, as I say, it was making solid money, let it play out, and then afterwards, you do your mainstream universe. But they didn't do that. They didn't do that. They panicked, they got reactive, they recycled Zack's Justice League. We'll never know how much money, theatrically, globally, Zack's Justice League would have made. I think it would have done better than Justice League. There's no question about that. So it's just a studio that got itself in trouble through its mentality, through seeing another studio making a lot of money out of comic book superhero films, but the people you had making DC movies in terms of Snyder and Goyer and Nolan weren't the ones to give you the mainstream universe you wanted. But you thought, hey, Christopher Nolan, David Goyer, you know, were behind the Dark Knight. What could possibly go wrong? Well, from their point of view, nothing went wrong with Man of Steel, right? Nothing. They made the movie they wanted to make. If you wanted a mainstream comic book universe to compete with the MCU, you shouldn't have allowed David Goyer and Zack Snyder and Christopher Nolan to make a Superman movie and set up that type of franchise. You should have made the same dumbed down shit that the MCU were making from the very beginning. But instead, they took the Snyderverse, They took the DCEU and recycled it into the MCU, and it didn't work. And even with gun, they've been trying the same old shit again. Some people never learn by their mistakes.